And then hopefully in like 5 seconds, we'll be live. 4, 3, 2, 1. Never time it right. There we go. So I'm live then with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. And is it right that you've got 2 PhDs?
That's correct.
Yeah, one in, is it computer engineering or computer science?
In computer engineering, and the other one in philosophy of mind.
Right. And so I've got an undergraduate degree in software engineering, so maybe some slight crossover there, and a personal interest in philosophy, but certainly not as
there you go.
certainly not as advanced as you are in the kind of journey along there. And you're also an idealist, which is an interesting philosophical position. Maybe most modern people tend to go towards some kind of materialism or something like that, and idealism is quite different. Is there anything else you think it's important to cover in your kind of background and stuff for people who aren't familiar with you that they might want to know?
No, the only observation I would make is when we talk about idealism, we mean metaphysical idealism, the idea that reality is essentially mental, because there is also ethical idealism, which is the notion that you follow ideals, and it's associated with naivete and things like that. That's not what I am. Metaphysical idealism should actually be called ideaism. But language worked out the way it did. So,
well, that's a point. It would be interesting to ask you about actually from a philosophical perspective, because like I'm familiar, say, with Bishop Berkeley's kind of arguments for subjective idealism, which people take in various ways, or kind of Kant's transcendental idealism, which might be saying something along the lines of everything that we're aware of is a percept or an idea. And then is it right to say then what the metaphysical idealism is doing is taking the next step to say, well, actually, outside of what's perceived, there isn't anything else. Like that's actually all there is fundamentally, or is this mental? No. Okay.
No,
could you describe it? Yeah.
What brings together all forms of idealism is the idea that reality is essentially an idea, a thought, not a human-like thought. That doesn't mean that reality is in my mind alone or your mind alone. Objective idealism would say that there are transpersonal mental states which constitute the world out there. It is still mental, but it's not your mind alone or my mind alone. So just to very briefly put it in a taxonomy, Bishop Berkeley would say, all I know about the world are my perceptions of it, and my perceptions are mental. Therefore, the world I perceive is mental, and out there is only the mind of God, which holds the state of the world when I'm not looking at it. So that's subjective idealism. Kant is more an epistemic statement. What he says is, all we can be aware of are our own perceptions, which are mental. The thing in itself out there, I cannot make any statement about it. So Kant doesn't say it's material or mental. He just says, I cannot make a statement about it. And then Schopenhauer comes along right after Kant and says, well, I can't make a statement about the world out there because I am not it. I only know it through how I represent it in my mind. But there is one thing in nature that I can know by being in it, and that's me. And from the inside, I am ideas. I am my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions. And then, and from the outside, I am the matter of my body. And then Schopenhauer extrapolated that and said, well, the world out there too presents itself to me in the screen of perception as what we call matter, but it in itself, the thing in itself, is also a stream of thoughts, emotions, ideas, volitional states that he called the will. I am an objective idealist, in the sense that I think there is really a world out there that we all inhabit, but that world is a thought. But there is a sense in which I am also a subjective idealist with regards to the physical world. I think the physical world comes into existence upon being measured, upon being observed. Before we measure it or observe it, there is no physical world. There is only a transpersonal thought out there. Physicality emerges upon observation. And I'm forced into this subjective idealist view by physics, the latest results emerging from physics. So I'm both a subjective idealist with regard to the physical world and an objective idealist with regard to the world out there, which is not physical, is mental.
So I think a lot of people, maybe of those who are listening, might say, well, it seems to be a more sort of commonsensical position to say, to infer that there is some kind of material reality within which, you know, I'm located and there are other minds and stuff. So what's your reason for thinking that, how'd you get to the position that rather than there being a material reality, that it's all ideas, all mental?
But what we call matter exists, obviously. I can hold my computer mouse and there are some percepts. I feel it's rigid, it has some texture and all that. So what we call matter exists. The problem is when we conceptually interpret what it is, and we say that it is something fundamentally outside and independent of mind. The moment we make this extra theoretical inference, we run into all kinds of problems because it's impossible to deduce how mind arises from matter. It's also problematic because it's inflationary. You postulate something more than what's given. What's given to you is mentality. Right. That's all you really have. That's all you know by acquaintance. Everything else is a theoretical inference, a guess. We don't need that guess. We don't need to guess that there is such a thing as matter outside and independent of mind to make sense of things. We can very well make sense of everything by saying there are transpersonal mental states which impinge on me and they modify my inner mental states in the same way that thoughts impinge on emotions and modify emotions, or the other way around as well. So this extra inference of materialism is problematic because it then fails to explain consciousness. It's inflationary, conceptually inflationary, and unnecessary. And basically what it does, it replaces the world for a description of the world. Matter is conceptually defined as that which can be exhaustively described by numbers. Like you put a little number, 5 kilos, that's mass. You put another number, it's electrical charge. Another number, it's size. Another number, it's spin, direction, amplitude, frequency, whatever. So we describe the contents of perception with all these numbers. And matter is what is exhaustively defined by these numbers. And then we say, well, matter precedes my perceptions. It precedes mind. Essentially what they are doing is they are replacing reality with a description. They are saying that the description is prior to that which is described, which is outright illogical. And that's why we run into all kinds of metaphysical problems today.
I think a lot of people as well would say, but perhaps this works philosophically, but then as we as we learn more and more about like neuroscience, for example, we learn that consciousness is intrinsically linked to the brain in some way. Perhaps, we're not going with a particular type identity theory or eliminativism or something, but in some way it seems that the brain is associated to mental. Now, you're saying here that it is, but those things metaphysically aren't, like matter isn't a different substance, or could you explain that a little bit? Yeah.
Of course, our inner life is intrinsically correlated with patterns of brain activity. I mean, you don't need to be a scientist to know that. Just drink alcohol, and that substance will go into your blood flow, and something will happen to your conscious inner life, or a psychedelic. Pills, psychoactive pills, or a bullet through your head will also have some major effect in your conscious inner life. So that's not denied. The thing is, even when we are entertaining idealism as a hypothesis, we are implicitly, in an unexamined way, still thinking in terms of materialism. We are still thinking in terms of the brain being material and generating mind. That's where it goes wrong. For you to do justice to the hypothesis of idealism, you have to think within the logic of idealism. Within that logic, matter is just the extrinsic appearance of a mental process. And that appearance is also mental. Your perceptions are mental. When you perceive my brain through a brain scanner, that's an image in perception. It's in consciousness. And that correlates with my first person experience of my inner life, which is also in consciousness. So all that is happening here is that conscious inner life can present itself in the form we call matter when observed from an external point of view, or to be more technical, from across a dissociative boundary. So when a surgeon brings an electrical probe to your brain and starts poking around and all kinds of things happen in your consciousness, what is happening there is one transpersonal mental process impinging and modulating another mental process. Under idealism, the surgeon's electrical probe is also the image of a mental process. The surgeon's scalpel or a bullet is also the image of a mental process. And that a surgeon's scalpel cutting through your brain or a bullet going through your head impact your conscious inner life only means that there is one mental process, a transpersonal one, affecting another mental process. In other words, your dissociated conscious inner life. So if you think in those terms, there is no dualism here. There is no substance dualism. There is only mind. Mind seemingly separates itself across different clusters due to dissociative boundaries. And when you observe mental processes across a dissociative boundary, that mental process will look like to you as matter, be it your brain, a surgeon's scalpel, a surgeon's electrical probe, a pill, a bullet, or a glass of beer.
So for my understanding of Berkeley would be something like the reason that we seem to be in this world, even though everything is dependent upon, to be is to be perceived, the reason that we have the appearance of this objective reality we're within is because God is perceiving everything. Now, is there something sort of similar on your view, or is it more kind of pantheistic in a way, like you were saying, like dissociative kind of nodes, in that we're all part of this could you explain, is there a role for God? Or
there is a lot to unpack here. Berkeley's hypothesis of God was not really to explain why we perceive the world the way we perceive. He wanted to explain why the world seems to hold a state even when nobody's looking. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody's looking at it, did it fall in the forest? And Berkeley would say, yes, because God was looking at it. God was perceiving it. And presumably what he meant is that God was perceiving it also as a tree in the same way that we would perceive it. Something with a trunk, with leaves, a root system stuck into the ground. I disagree with all that. I think what holds the state of the world is a transpersonal mind. Now, you may want to call it God. I may not protest against it, but let me just qualify it by saying that I do not assume that this transpersonal mind is premeditating, is self-conscious, metacognitive, has high-level mental functions. I don't presume that it's planning things and it's choosing for things to be the way they are. I don't think that's the case. I think this transpersonal mental mind is just a set of instinctive, natural processes. They do what they do because they are what they are, and they can't be anything else because that's what they are. So I am a naturalist. I don't see transpersonal mental states as being comparable to a human like God sitting on a throne and making decisions about who's going to live, who's going to die. That's not how I see it. Again, I am a naturalist. Transpersonal mental states, in my view, are instinctive and they unfold according to natural patterns and regularities. But what would the world look like if nobody were looking at it? Then to go back to Berkeley's initial motivation to postulate God. Would the tree still look like a tree if nobody were looking at it? I don't think it would. You see, if nobody's looking at my brain, from the inside, my brain is my conscious inner life. And my conscious inner life doesn't look at all like a network of firing neurons in a gel. It doesn't look at all like that. If nobody is looking at my brain, I think the only thing that is left is my conscious inner life. For the same reason, I think if nobody's looking at the inanimate universe, no living being is measuring the physical world, then the physical world doesn't look physical, because physicality is what it looks like from across a dissociative boundary. If there are no dissociated consciousnesses looking at it, then it doesn't look like the inanimate physical universe. The only thing that remains is the first-person perspective of the inanimate universe. And that, I think, will not look at all like stars and galaxies. It will look like endogenous experiential states of the kind Schopenhauer called the will, instinctive, volitional states. It's only when somebody looks at it from across a dissociative boundary that it then presents itself to the observer as physicality. If nobody's observing, then it's not physical. And I think physics itself is forcing us towards that conclusion.
So this kind of ultimate metaphysical substance of mind on this idealistic view, is it constrained in any sense by is it governed by mathematics in some sense, or is there something to it conceptually that is other than mental, that is kind of works alongside it?
Well, mentality has properties. You don't need something other than mentality to explain why mentality unfolds in a certain way and not another. It unfolds in that way because it is what it is. It has certain properties. In psychological terms, you could say that the universal mind unfolds according to certain templates of experience that Jung called archetypes. So there are archetypes, templates of experiencing that are inherent to the universal mind. Is that a constraint? No, in the sense that you cannot be constrained by what you are. You just happen to be what you are. It's not a constraint enforced from the outside, because there is no outside. Universal mind is all there is. But although it is all there is what it is, and not something else. And therefore, it unfolds the way it unfolds and not in any other way. So there are natural laws. Laws are just descriptions. And there are natural laws intrinsic to what mind at large is. And we can infer those natural laws by observing the patterns and regularities with which nature behaves. And then we can describe it mathematically. Does it mean that this mind at large is mathematical? No, it is just mind. It is what it is, but we can describe its unfolding in mathematical terms. And maybe some of the underlying templates, some of the underlying archetypes are mathematical in nature, in the sense that they fit very well with mathematical descriptions.
So I'm thinking as you're speaking as well, like I'm very I find myself constantly getting kind of stuck with some of these idealist ideas about the way my perceptions appear to me, and things. I get not the kind of Kantian idea of not being able to speak of that thing that isn't mental or get beyond it. And one thing I sometimes wonder about is, well, an independent material world could be the case, and my mind could somehow arise out of that, but it would still appear to me in that way. The appearances of it would be the exact same. Is that something you've kind of considered on your view, how it could be kind of like a fallible, a human, maybe I'm not wording this very well, like a human fallibilistic kind of, it appears to us this way, but it's actually kind of wrong in the sort of almost skepticism.
We cannot have final metaphysical certainty, but that applies always throughout history. All we can hope to get to is the best hypothesis given our observations and our logic. That's all. What is the best hypothesis about the nature of reality given our observations, science, and our logical way of thinking. But even if you admit to that, I think given our observations and our logical way of thinking, materialism is not the best hypothesis. In fact, it's probably the worst hypothesis on the table today by far. Even it's incoherent, and it's empirically very fallible, it has very little explanatory power. It fails to explain experience, which arguably is all we have, is all there is. That's why I'm an idealist. But I acknowledge that idealism, just like materialism, is a theoretical inference. It's not something that you can directly become acquainted with. Perhaps you can when you die and your dissociation ends and you become the universe. Then maybe you will know the universe from a first-person perspective, and you will know, oh, it's mental. But for as long as we are alive and dissociated, this is a theoretical inference, a very good one, but an inference nonetheless. Just an inference that's better than all others.
So, are you familiar as well with the way that some of your work on metaphysical idealism has been used by kind of like apologists with different perhaps theological convictions than yourself. And do you have any thoughts on that kind of use for, say, specifically Christian theism? Or I've not really seen it, but I'm sure there's probably some Muslims who have been thinking, you know, I can take this and apply it to my idea of God as like a pure will or something like that.
I don't have anything against people who having understood what I'm saying, run with it and enrich their lives with it and inform their other views with it. I mean, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's exactly what I'm trying to achieve, is to have people take these ideas on board and inform their lives and their thinking with it, which inevitably would translate into them extrapolating it in other directions. So long as they don't misunderstand or misrepresent what I'm saying, I have nothing against them adding to it or interpreting it in a certain way. I may agree or disagree with their interpretation, but I don't deny their right to do what they are doing, because that's the very point of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to put a message out there so people can inform their lives with it and run with it.
So we're talking about people, I suppose, informing their lives with it. What would you hope that people do kind of apply for, you know, if we come to this kind of view of the world metaphysically, but then it's like I find myself as this node of conscious experience within whatever. How does that then inform sort of these questions of, you know, how I'm meant to live? Or is there much thinking around how it changes a person's kind of outlook as an individual?
I think for me, it changes everything. Now, this is something that is very personal. Your metaphysical views inform your ethics. That's undeniable. Even if you don't know that they are informing your ethics, they are informing your ethics in an unexamined way, an implicit way. For me, I mean, as an idealist, if you realize and you're convinced of it, that your core subjectivity, not your personal self, not your narrative of self, but your core subjectivity, that looks out to the world through you, that core subjectivity will never end. I become invested in the long-term future of this planet and humanity. I will not think along the lines of, well, you know, maybe global warming will be a problem 100 years from now. Not even my grandchildren will be alive, so to hell with it. No, because in my view, I will be there. My core subjectivity will be there, because everything is unfolding within my core subjectivity, not Bernardo Kastrup, but the universal consciousness that I ultimately am. And you are that too, and so is everybody, and so are my cats, and all living beings. So it changes that. It also changes my view of what good health is, because if my body is the extrinsic appearance of my dissociated mental processes, even the ones I can't access through introspection, then there are two avenues to care about my health. One is the third person avenue, namely surgery and drugs. But there is also an inner avenue through mental hygiene. If I have good mental hygiene, then certain illnesses, which in my view are the extrinsic appearance of dysfunctional mental processes that I can't introspect into, maybe I can influence them through mental hygiene, through mindfulness, through depth psychology, through meditation. So that opens up a whole other universe for healthcare intervention. I mean, things like the placebo effect, which we know happens. It's very confusing because we don't know how it occurs, but we know for sure that it occurs. It's a big economic problem today, by the way, because to get new medicines approved, you have to show that your medicines are significantly better than placebo, but placebo is getting better and better. So to get new medicines approved, you have to beat improving placebo effect, and companies are going haywire with that. It's an existential threat to them, but nobody's stopping to think, hey, the placebo effect works. can't we leverage it then? We don't know how it works. We don't understand it, but we know that it works. So we might as well use it because it is quite effective. It is effective as a replacement for knee surgery, even. There has been research done. You get fake knee surgery, the scars and everything, but no intervention is done in your knees. And
Right.
you wake up and you go like, oh, I have no knee pain anymore. And then when you tell these people a month later you didn't get knee surgery, they think you're full of it, that they mixed up your files. It's impossible. So all these things change. My sense of morality changes. If you see the same core subjectivity behind the eyes of every person, suddenly you are a lot less judgmental, you know, a lot less judgmental about what's going on in the world. So, but how other people will inform their morality, their ethics based on this metaphysics is their problem. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's their responsibility to do that. Nobody can do it for them. So long as people don't conflate particular moral codes with my metaphysics, so long as they have a metaphysics inform their moral codes, but they don't mix it back with the metaphysics, because metaphysics is morally neutral. It's ethically neutral. It's okay, so long as people run with the conclusions of analytic idealism to substantiate their own religious views, it's okay, so long as they don't project those religious views back on analytic idealism. In other words, so long as religion and morality doesn't hijack a metaphysics, I think it's perfectly valid that a metaphysics informs religion and morality. Not only valid, it is the point of a metaphysics.
I suppose as you were talking then, I was a little bit confused by you linking it into caring about issues like global warming, for example. Like so I suppose I understand on this view why you would be concerned about the experience of other conscious agents, but this universal consciousness seems to me to be something that is sort of privy to the center of what's going on at the sun or whatever, and probably doesn't care about a few degrees of change here on Earth. So is that to do with the suffering it would cause to conscious disassociated conscious beings on Earth?
Yeah.
Or is that
I see how you're thinking, and it's the price I pay by putting out my story in clear conceptual terms.
Right.
Because then people understand universal consciousness conceptually, but they don't identify with it. They think, oh, it's something out there. It's not really me. I'm just a dissociated alter of it. Maybe I will be it again once I die, but right now I'm not it. Well, in fact, it is really you. But conceptually, we can't convey that. I can only do that by analogy. Think the following. When you dream at night, you are dissociated from the part of your mind that conjures up the rest of the dream. You're identified only with your avatar in the dream. And if your avatar is walking down a street, then you don't think as your avatar that you are the buildings or the cars or the other people you are seeing. You think of that as something else outside of you. But when you wake up, you realize that, oh, it was you doing the whole thing. It was you doing the avatar. It was you doing the cars, everything. It was all you. That dissociation ends when you wake up. But you remember what it was like to be dissociated. You remember what it was like to be in the dream and thinking that the buildings and the cars were all outside you and you were not them. And when you wake up, your dream avatar is dead. He's toast. He has ceased to exist. But do you mourn it? Do you mourn the death of your dream avatar every morning when you wake up? You don't, because you realize that it was an artifact of mentation to begin with. It didn't have real existence. The only thing that existed all along was you, the non-dissociated you when you wake up. So you don't mourn the death of something that never existed to begin with. It was just a trick of mind, an illusion.
I suppose, though, could one not argue then almost like how would I know when if this is correct and I died and it was like that, how could I know I was in like base reality as well, so to speak? How could I not know it didn't regress back further?
It could be a Russian doll. Yeah, it could be a hierarchy. I don't see strong enough reasons to think that there is a very deep hierarchy. I have had intuitive insights that there is, but if I stick to my empirical self, I would have to objectively say, we don't need that hierarchy to make sense of things. And if you don't need it, then I don't postulate it. I try to stick to the simplest, most conceptually parsimonious approach. But what I was trying to say is, when you wake up, you realize that your dream avatar was you all along, and you were doing all the rest. But you have just had a very bad nightmare, and you suffered a lot in your nightmare, and you woke up from it and you realized, oh, it was all an illusion. But you still suffered as your dream avatar. You suffered. Nobody likes to have nightmares, even though they wake up from each one of them realizing that it was an illusion, that they were not that dream avatar, or they were the dream avatar, but they were everything else as well. You know, the bear trying to kill you, you know, you were everything, and you suffered for no reason, but you suffered. For the same reason that we still care about a nightmare after we wake up, because we did suffer, I still care about what will be happening on this planet 100 years from now, because it will be me waking up from that and still remembering, oh, I suffered.
I see. Yeah.
Know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes more sense. And as you know, as someone who's had psychedelic experiences, I think the type of metaphysics that you're describing, you know, is sort of comports to a lot of what those experiences are kind of like. But the thing is, when I'm outside of those experiences, and this perhaps comes back to my earlier question about, you know, how could we tell between it just appearing that way or the kind of skeptical, is that, you know, as I look into, like, say, the research that's done around these sorts of things, it's like, oh, there's areas of my brain associated with the ego, or that
there are
down regulate when, you know, if you take psilocybin or something. And so that would make sense with my feeling of my consciousness being, you know, the feeling of not being separated from my environment or something. And is that a more parsimonious explanation than, you know, my experience being correct, that actually I was tapping back into what consciousness really is, or something in that state? It's like
there is no difference. That explanation is true for as long as you don't make too many metaphysical inferences along the materialist road. There is a certain area of your brain, you know, the default mode network, the patterns of activity in that area are associated with your narrative of personal, individual, separate self. It has to do with brooding, with introspection, the things that define you seemingly as a separate individual from all the rest. We know that psychedelics dampen activity, brain activity, everywhere in the brain, but particularly in the default mode network, and therefore dissolves your narrative of self, of personal self. And then you are left with the reality that underlies that narrative, which is you are the whole shebang, you are the whole thing. Once you are freed from that narrative, you realize what's actually going on. A materialist would interpret the psychedelic effect as activating in some way activity in your brain, or changing activity in your brain in some way, so that it generates the psychedelic experience. Because it's not only that you lose your ego in a psychedelic experience, you experience a whole lot of things as well. You know, things that people describe as alien beings, parallel universes, and whatnot. Things that transcend not only physics but logic itself. So a materialist interpretation of that would say, yes, you lose your narrative of self, because even a materialist would agree it's an illusion. And you change brain activity in such a way that this changed brain activity generates all the rest. The problem is that you can't say that you are activating the brain in other areas to generate the rest of the psychedelic experience, because there are no activations. Every psychedelic that has been studied, DMT, psilocybin, everything, has shown that the brain activity only decreases during a psychedelic trip, a mind-boggling psychedelic trip, the most intense, rich, structured experience you can possibly have in life, is accompanied by your brain basically going to sleep as far as metabolic levels. And researchers are now, in a very desperate way, I would characterize it as that, trying to find something that does increase in the brain in order to account for the psychedelic experience in materialistic terms. And the theory that they are putting forward now, called the anthropic brain, is I mean, it's ridiculous, really. And it's only not considered ridiculous because we still have materialism underlying all of our thinking. And if it's the only way to save materialism, then something that is absurd will be accepted as, well, once we discard the impossible, the absurd must be, what's left. What they're basically saying is that the psychedelic experience is the outcome of increased noise levels in your brain.
Right.
Noise, unstructured brain activity. Brain activity levels decrease, but they also become noisier, less structured, and there is more functional coupling across different brain areas. And they say that that accounts for the psychedelic experience. Well, there are two problems with this. One, a psychedelic experience is not white noise. It's highly structured. It's very, very rich and structured. So it's difficult to say that, well, it's just noise in the brain that generated it. Another problem is that for other things like dreams or imagination, we know that there are very clear patterns of brain activation that correlate with inner experience. We can now do brain image extraction. We can hook you up to a functional brain scanner, read the patterns of your brain activity, and guess very accurately what you are thinking, what you're imagining, what you're watching on the TV, supposing that the TV is not available to the researchers themselves. We can correlate so well patterns of activation in the brain and experience that it's difficult to say now that, well, if consciousness in all ordinary cases correlates with brain activation, why under a psychedelic experience, which is analogous to a dream in a certain way, would correlate with increased brain noise and deactivation everywhere? I mean, two explanations for the same thing. I mean, this is a sign of desperation of metaphysical materialism, if you ask me. I think it's bordering on the ridiculous now, what people are postulating. But we will only overcome this once we open our minds a little bit more and examine our hidden metaphysical assumptions.
Do you think there are certain features of something like a psychedelic experience which are perhaps better explained by the materialist account? So, something like picking out faces in like the grain of wood patterns or something. And this makes sense if there's a region of the brain which is associated with doing that, and the connectivity between that and other areas is upregulated or something. Do these things sort of reduce your, is there evidence that kind of counts against the idealist thing, or?
No, you have to find differentiating evidence. Let's take what you just named. In a psychedelic experience, your brain is apt to make more associations, and therefore you will see more patterns that you would otherwise not see, because there is less filtering of this pattern matching function of the brain. Now, this is the materialist explanation. The idealist explanation for the same thing would be, those patterns of brain activity are not what is generating your increased ability to pattern match. They are the image of a more relaxed, less localized consciousness that can pattern match more. So this specific thing does not differentiate between materialism and idealism, because for materialism, well, the correlation is because one causes the other. Under idealism, the correlation is because one is the image of the other. In both cases, you have the same level of correlation. You require a fine level of correlation. So it doesn't differentiate. What would differentiate materialism and idealism is this. In a psychedelic trip, you have a mind-boggling, rich, structured experience, while your brain activity is low, is reduced. And the idealist would explain that by, okay, the reduced brain activity reduces dissociation. So your mind literally expands, because the image of a dissociated mind is ordinary brain activity. If ordinary brain activity is reduced in just the right way, at the right spots, that is what a reduction in dissociation will look like. And less dissociation means enriched inner life. So for idealism, that's okay. But for materialism, all brain activity, all experience is generated by brain metabolism, brain activity. That person still has a brain, but no metabolism. So presumably that person has no experience, right? So that's the materialist approach. So for a materialist, it's much harder to make sense of how inner experience can become much richer, mind-bogglingly richer, while brain activity is reducing everywhere. That's differentiating. The pattern matching thing is not. It's both predict that there will be tight correlations.
I suppose then I'm thinking, is there something that you think would falsify this position in general? Is that, like what could you find that would make you think, or is there like a strongest objection or something to your position that you're aware of?
We have to keep in mind that a metaphysical theory is not a scientific theory.
Right.
In other words, it's not predicting natural behavior. Scientific theories predict natural behavior. So we can compare that to experiment and figure out which one is right, which one is wrong, and you can invalidate some. Metaphysical theories need to be consistent with science. Otherwise, it doesn't even start. If you contradict a natural behavior that has been shown to be the case by science, then your metaphysics is wrong. You're done with it. But not you may not be able to distinguish or to select a metaphysical theory based purely on scientific terms. I mean, the flying spaghetti monster cannot be falsified on a scientific basis. Why do we don't take it seriously? Because it's inflationary. You don't need all those postulates, a monster in some other dimension that looks like spaghetti, and it's impacting on everything. It's moving all the pawns on the board. We don't need that complexity to make sense of things. We can make sense of things with less complexity. On the same basis, I would say we don't need materialism. Idealism can make sense of everything on a more parsimonious basis without postulating other ontological categories and funny interactions between mind and matter. Now, having said that, there are scientific observations that materialism contradicts. The whole field of foundations of physics now, unless you're a believer in that fairy tale magical story of multiple parallel universes coming into existence every Planck time, unless you believe that fairy tale, you're forced today to acknowledge that physical realism has been experimentally refuted. The idea that there are physical objects with defined properties out there when nobody's measuring or looking at them, that has been refuted. And guess what? Materialism as a metaphysics presumes that to be the case, or assumes that to be the case. So that contradicts materialism right there. How can you be a materialist without physical realism? I pose this challenge now to anybody who is a materialist and acknowledges that physical realism has been refuted, how that can be reconciled. So I would say there is scientific evidence that refutes materialism. What scientific evidence could refute idealism?
Or perhaps philosophical argumentation even, what sort of things what's the strongest objection that, is there anything that's made you think, this is like a real problem for this view metaphysically? Or, I don't know, maybe someone could come up with a more simple metaphysics with, like, I don't know enough to neutral monism or something. So I don't know. Yeah.
The biggest challenge for analytic idealism, and again, every time I say idealism, I mean analytic idealism. The biggest challenge is an epistemic one. It's very difficult for the vast majority of people to imagine how one mind can be many while remaining one. In other words, to imagine how co-consciousness can arise through dissociation. Most people can't conceive of it. Some people can, because they have undergone that psychiatric condition called dissociative identity disorder. So they know pretty well that this happens, and they can conceive of it because they remember how it was. I can't conceive of it, although I didn't have a pathological form of dissociation, but I have had many moments in my life when I realized, oh, I have been feeling like this for quite a while, but I was not explicitly aware of it because I was dissociated. There was a part of me that had the feeling and another part of me that was going about life without having the feeling. Once the dissociation ends, you realize that you were both of those parts, and you hold the memories of both of those parts. So you still remember how it was to be each one of them independent of the other. But this requires a level of subtlety in introspection that most people don't even have the chance to develop because they're too busy going about, surviving, going about the activities of life. And most people don't have even the predisposition to do this kind of exercises. It's abstract to them. although it's very concrete to anybody who has had the experience. So I think that's the greatest challenge. That's the one key reason why intelligent people would reject analytic idealism, is their inability to conceive of one mind becoming many while remaining one. This seeming contradiction, it's not a contradiction at all, it just seems to be like that in language. It's very difficult to them, and that is grounds for many of them to say, no, I reject it because I can't conceive of it, despite the empirical reality of dissociation in psychiatry being now outright undeniable. Since the emergence of neuroimaging in this century, we know that dissociative identity disorder is real. We know that dissociative processes in a patient's brain look like something that is discernible from everything else. We know that dissociative identity disorder patients, they can dream the same dream. Multiple authors of that one patient can experience the same dream from different points of view. Now, that's pretty much what's happening right now, right? If analytic idealism is right, there is only one mind experiencing the dream of life from many different points of view. And guess what? We know clinically that this happens to patients of dissociative identity disorder. They wake up from a dream, and each author remembers the dream from a different perspective, being a different author in that dream, although it was the same dream for them all. So despite all this massive amount of empirical evidence telling us now there is a process in nature that does exactly what analytic idealism is saying happens, we know this happens in nature. Despite all this, because of the inability of many to conceive of it conceptually, it is still rejected. Now, obviously, I can't think of an existing piece of science that would contradict analytic idealism. Otherwise, I would have formulated it in a different way. I would not voluntarily contradict science. That's not my character. I was a scientist. I had scientists written on my little business card for years. I'm totally pro-science. Now, could I imagine an observation that has not yet been done that could refute idealism? Not in the sense that, no, I can't imagine it right now. I mean, if no, okay, let me put it this way. Analytic idealism predicts that some, not all, some impairments of brain activity or reductions of brain activity, some of them should correlate with expanded conscious inner life. Why? Because ordinary brain activity is not only the image of your mental contents, but also the image of the process of dissociation itself. Which parts of your brain correspond to the dissociation and which parts to your inner mental contents? It's not clear yet, and neuroscience hasn't advanced that much yet. You're
not recommending people stick pencils up their nose or something?
No, no, absolutely not. I'm not even recommending the choking game that teenagers play worldwide to partly choke themselves, reduce their brain activity significantly in order to have a transcendent godlike experience. You know, teenagers die every now and then playing this silly game. It's like tripping without drugs, and I know why it happens. It reduces brain activity as well if you cut blood flow to your brain. So I'm not recommending any of that. My point is, part of what we call an ordinary brain, ordinary activity, is the image of the dissociative process. So at least some impairments of brain activity, some reductions of brain activity should correlate with enriched inner life, in that it reduces the dissociation. If the dissociation is reduced, of course, you experience more. You experience things that are beyond your dissociative boundary, and you have enriched inner life. That's a prediction of idealism that differentiates it from materialism. Materialism would make no such prediction, because under materialism, brain activity generates experience. So you cannot have more experience with having less brain activity, overall brain activity. And I'm aware of all that talk about inhibitory processes. And now if you reduce inhibitory processes, yes, you can have more experience, because then you get an increased brain activity somewhere else. So what is then the empirical verdict of this? Well, the verdict is there are certain impairments of brain activity and reductions of brain activity that enrich experience. So that didn't refute idealism. It's the only thing I could think of that would refute idealism, but it didn't, because this pattern is across the board. It's not only choking, it's not only psychedelics, it's also brain damage because of war trauma. It's also the advancement of dementia, near-death experiences because of cardiac arrest, all kinds of things. That hyperventilation also reduces brain activity because your capillaries in the brain, they constrict due to the increased alkalinity of your hyperoxygenated blood. So that reduces brain activity. That's why you can pass out if you hyperventilate. So there is a broad pattern showing that some impairments of brain activity do increase experience. So no, it didn't refute idealism. If anything, it refuted materialism.
So just wondering for time, by the way, are you okay at the moment? Okay, good. So you said as well that there were a few things from physics which supported your view, and I'm assuming that they're to do with quantum phenomena of some sort. Could you kind of briefly go over what they are and how they kind of support your case?
Yeah. So there is this prediction of quantum mechanics called entanglement. And that basically means if two elementary particles are generated in a special way, they remain intrinsically interconnected. In other words, you cannot describe one without the other. Whichever way you describe one of them, you'll be assuming the behavior of the other in that description. That's what quantum physics predicts. You have this entanglement. And this would be valid irrespective of the distance between the two particles. So even if one particle is on one side of the universe and the other particle on the other side, you still cannot describe them independently of one another. And Einstein referred to it as spooky action at a distance because it seems to violate relativity, the speed of light limit. Because if you think of it in terms of one particle sending a signal to the other, telling the other, oh, I'm behaving this way, so you behave that other way, when that signal would have to obey the speed of light limit. And we know experimentally now that, there is no opportunity for any signal to go from one particle to the other under the speed of light limit. And you still cannot describe them separate from one another. They are still inherently two sides of the same system. They are entangled, as physicists say. Now, in the early days, many physicists thought this prediction of quantum mechanics would not bear out. We would realize that, that this only holds within the speed of light limit, because we didn't have technology to test it beyond that limit. Now, light is very fast. You got to do the experiment really, really fast before light has an opportunity to play a role, the speed of light limit. But we had a theoretical result from a physicist called, I think Alexander Bell was his name. And he showed that even if you postulated that there are some hidden things, some hidden information flowing from one particle to the other, the predictions of quantum mechanics would violate this hidden, they call it the hidden properties or the hidden variables interpretation. So quantum mechanics, what it predicts cannot be explained by some hidden variables local to the particles. In other words, I'm making a mess of this, but let me try to clarify from the beginning again. The idea is, although the particles can't communicate under the speed of light limit, maybe there was some property they shared from the moment they were created. And that shared property, that we don't know what it is, but that shared property accounts for their entangled behavior. That's the theory. Bell showed that this theory contradicts the predictions of quantum mechanics. And guess what? In the late 70s and early 80s, we've shown that quantum mechanics was right. And therefore, local hidden variables was discarded as a theory, except for some possible loopholes which were closed over time. But we still had this dichotomy. Either things are not local or there is no real particles out there. but we couldn't differentiate between these two hypotheses. And most physicists would say, well, locality has been defeated. The universe is not local. There is some underlying thing, some underlying properties mirrored out across space and time that makes the particles behave in an entangled way. But the particles are still out there, whether we are looking at them or not. And then another physicist, Tony Leggett, in 2003, also proved other mathematical results showing that there were certain observations that if we could make them, if they could be proven empirically, they would discard physical realism in respect of locality. In other words, they would show that there are no particles out there if nobody's measuring them. And those results were empirically confirmed in 2007, and then again in 2010, and loopholes were closed up until 2018, when a big test was done. There was a big test also done here in the Netherlands in 2015. There are no loopholes left. So now your option is the following. Either you acknowledge that there is no physical realism, in other words, that physical things are not out there until you measure them, until you look at them. They don't exist as physical things until you measure. Or you have to believe that at every Planck scale of time, which is unimaginably small, a femtosecond is much, much, much bigger than the age of the universe compared to Planck time. So you have to believe that at every Planck time, a near infinitude of new physical universes pop into existence, which is probably the most unparsimonious, unlikely thing that human thought can conceive. So that's the option now. You either believe in this little magical tale of an infinitude of parallel universes having started since we began this conversation, physical parallel universe that physically exist, whether we are looking at them or not, or you have to acknowledge that what is out there is not physical. It only becomes physical upon observation, upon measurement. In other words, what's out there is a thought, and it shows itself to you as physicality when you look at it. Pick your options. People like physicist Shan Carroll, who is very fond of believing these little fairy tales, which for me defy reason, defy logic, defy empiricism, because we don't have any empirical reason to believe in all these parallel universes, defy physics, defy the values of rationality, if you ask me, but that's what they prefer. Then you will believe in these multiple parallel universes. I prefer to think that what's out there is something I know exists as a category. It's a thought. I know thoughts exist because I have them. I just need to extrapolate and say, there's a thought out there beyond me as well. And that thought, once I interact with it, becomes what we call physicality.
So then I also wanted to ask you, and then we can get into some questions from people who've been watching, if there's time as well. You've had a bit of a back and forth recently with Professor Philip Goff, who I think is at Durham University, and he's a panpsychist, which is alternative philosophy of mind, but also alternative kind of metaphysical system. And one of your, perhaps more so than the disagreements between you, I was more interested in some of your views of philosophy in general that were coming out in that disagreement, where you were talking about philosophy being something that you think should be something that almost orders the way that a person lives, something very kind of, because it's so deeply tied to their ethical system and a way of life sort of thing. Could you kind of elaborate on what philosophy is to you along those lines, and how someone should live the philosophical life in a way that's kind of authentic?
Well, in that particular context, I was referring mostly to philosophy of mind.
Okay.
I think if you do philosophy of mind, you have a responsibility to introspect. Because how can you do philosophy of mind without knowing your own mind to at least some degree, right? If you don't know what mind is, and the only mind you can know is yours, how can you do philosophy of mind? What are you trying to explain? You're trying to explain something you still don't know by acquaintance? You're shooting blind. So my point was that you cannot do philosophy of mind as if it were a conceptual card game in which each card is a concept and you arrange them on a table in front of you until you get to some picture that pleases you and seems to account for everything. It has to be more than that. Philosophy of mind has to be more than that. It has to take into account what we can know about mind through deep introspection. It cannot be a conceptual game. You can do engineering as a conceptual game. I'm a computer engineer. Right behind me here, there is a workbench in which I build my own computers and modify my computers for fun. And that's a conceptual game. It happens on a workbench in front of me. I don't need to deeply introspect to do that. But if you are a philosopher of mind, you cannot turn philosophy of mind into a conceptual card game. You have to, it has to go inwards, not only outwards. You have a responsibility to do it that way. Otherwise, what will happen is exactly what I mentioned to you earlier. People will reject analytic idealism because they cannot conceive of a co-conscious dissociation. And they cannot conceive of it because they don't introspect. They don't bother about introspection. They think that philosophy can be done as a little card game or a mathematical equation. It's not. It's philosophy of mind. Please know mind before you start trying to explain it. Before you start saying that, oh, this is inconceivable. What is conceivable? Have you tried to conceive it deeply by looking within? And I also think that the philosophy of mind shouldn't be done in a way that the moment you arrive at a hypothesis that you think is good, you immediately communicate it. And then a year later, you realize that it was nonsense. And then you, oh, but there is that thing that will solve all the problems, and you communicate it again, and you write another book. I acknowledge that the best way to learn is to discuss, is to talk, so you can expose your ideas to others, so you can be shot at, so you can review it. But I think it shouldn't be done in a way that every step of the way you look like you're committed to it, and you publish a book about it, and you say, this is my position. It should be done more informally, maybe through essays, papers here and there, and you should say, well, this is tentative, no, it's just a hypothesis. I think it should be taken more seriously than, okay, now I have the solution to all the problems. And then next year you have another solution to all the problems. And that happens when you're playing with it as if it were a card game, and you rearrange the cards on the table, and you're like, oh, this looks better. And now you write another book about it. I take exception with that because I labored for 20 years before I published anything. Now, that maybe is extreme. In academia, that would be impossible because you have to publish a certain number of papers every year. So you're basically forced to put out half-baked stuff in academia. And I recognize that, and I feel empathy for people who are forced to find themselves in that situation. I was lucky enough, I never worked for academia, so I talked a lot about my ideas, but I didn't come out committed to it until they were more or less solid, not final, but until I felt some confidence that what I'm saying will survive the test of time, at least a little bit. I think it's a sign of maturity if you act that way.
So I do have more questions on some of the things you just said, but I think I'll go over to what people have been asking in the chat. I had just like some of the things you were saying about denying the kind of private access that we have to our own minds, and maybe some of the objections that people like the Churchlands and things might raise to that. But I don't know, we could be here a long while if we go down all of these sort of things. So someone from the chat has asked, is there a difference between real and only imagined things under your view? Can one have false beliefs?
Surely. I mean, the world is pretty full of false beliefs. I think we need a slightly different theory of truth for that. There is a reality out there that is independent of my mind, your mind, and any other person's mind. And therefore, if we make a statement about that reality, you can check that statement against this objective reality out there and figure out if your statement is right or wrong. Now, your inner reality and that outside reality are both mental, but you can still compare a mental statement against a transpersonal mental phenomenon and figure out, is it right or wrong? So it's a different kind of theory of truth. You're not comparing mentality with materiality outside mentality. You're comparing certain statements of mentality against other processes of mentality. And you are figuring out whether the statement matches with the mental process. That's one criterion. There is another possible criterion, and that has to do with consensus. If you say something that the rest of the world knows to not be the case, I mean, even if you are, suppose you hallucinate that there is, I don't know, a parrot perched on your window in the middle of winter. You hallucinated it. It's in the middle of winter, everything's white, it's minus 20 degrees Celsius outside, and you see a parrot outside your window. What is the truth value of that? Did you see a parrot? Well, insofar as you have experienced seeing a parrot, it's true. You have had the experience of seeing a parrot. A hallucination is true as such, as a hallucination, as an experience. It is true. But if there were 20 other people around you, would they have seen the parrot? Most likely not. So if you make a statement, there was an objective parrot out there that other people would have seen, then on that basis, you could say, well, that statement is false. Your experience is true, but your statement about other people's experiences was false, because they most likely would have had a different experience. And we know that because we can actually put them there and see if they see the same thing. And they don't. So that's another criterion of truth. So there are still criteria for truth, for illusion. Ultimately, everything is mental. So if you define illusion as that which has grounding in something non-mental, then everything is an illusion. But you would only define it this way if you're a materialist. Well, you can't import that into idealism. You have to be consistent within the framework of idealism. So within that framework, there would still be such a thing as illusions and not illusions, truth and false. These things would survive. You would have to adapt the criteria. The correspondence theory of truth would have to be adapted, but there would still be truth and false.
So another question that someone's asked is, isn't it possible for a simpler and more parsimonious theory to be false? So I guess they're kind of questioning something like Occam's razor there. Or,
no, yeah. Of course, there's nothing etched in stone in nature that says all simple things are the true ones, or all true things must be the simple stone. It's not etched in stone in nature. Occam's razor is a guideline. It's a rule of thumb. It's not a law of nature. Of course, things could be a lot more complex than our simplest explanations. The simplest explanation there is mental solipsism. You are the only thing going on. Everybody else are just figments of your own imagination. Nobody else has inner life. Yeah, I would even argue this is actually not the simplest. I elaborate on this in my book, Why Materialism is Baloney, but I'm not going to get into that. So yes, it's a guideline. But that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is not, could something more complicated be true? Yes, it could, but it's not interesting. The interesting question is the following. Do we have any reason to choose a more complicated theory when we already have a simpler one? On the basis of what would we choose the more complicated one? That's the interesting question. That's the question one has to ask oneself. For instance, suppose you wake up one day and you go to your backyard and you see some strange footprints on your backyard. And then there are two possible explanations for this. One, a burglar tried to break into your house and left some footprints. And that's why you don't recognize the footprints. The burglar's shoes were different from your shoes. Explanation number one. Explanation number two, an alien spaceship landed on your neighbor's backyard. And the aliens came out and stole your neighbor's shoes. And then one of those aliens wearing your neighbor's shoes jumped over the fence and came for a stroll around your backyard. Then he jumped back, put your neighbor's shoes exactly where they were, went back to the spaceship and onto space and to the galaxy of Andromeda. Both explanations make sense of the facts. On a purely empirical basis, you cannot refute either. But would you choose the alien explanation over the burglar? You see, if we don't use Occam's razor as a guideline, we open the gates to all kinds of nonsense, all kinds of silliness. So I think it's not advisable to do that. But then if you choose not to do that, then now you have to be consistent. Now you chose that you adopt Occam's razor in the sense that given two explanations, the simplest one is more likely, you should apply this guideline consequently. And then you have to apply it even to materialism itself. And when you do, materialism is out the window. What's left is analytic idealism.
So another question that's come in is, well, this one's more of a comment that someone said who is a naturalist. They've said, if the natural world behaved in a way that depended on my mental experience rather than independently of it, I would lower my confidence in materialism. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on this person's.
When you are dreaming, having a nightmare, does the nightmare obey your wishes? It doesn't. When you are suffering from anxiety, can you stop your anxiety by just deciding that you shouldn't feel anxious anymore? You can't. If you're schizophrenic, do your hallucinations obey your commands? No, they don't. So even within the realm of our own personal minds, our mentation doesn't obey our choices and preferences. Why would the world beyond our personal minds, mental as it is, obey our preferences? Even our nightmares don't. Even our neuroses don't. Even our hallucinations don't. Even our anxieties don't. I mean, why would the world out there? It's an illusion, this idea that everything that is mental obeys my will, obeys my volition. It's nonsense. Not even your thoughts. You cannot choose your next thought. If you pay attention, you don't choose your thoughts. The next thing that pops into your mind was not chosen by you. You hardly choose anything that happens in your own mental sphere. Why would a mental world out there obey your choices? But okay, from a conceptual perspective, the world out there, although it's mental, it doesn't obey your choices because you are dissociated from it. That's what life is. Life is the image of a dissociative process in universal mind. And you are a dissociated alter. Because you are dissociated, the world out there behaves independently of your mental inner life. Of course it does. You're dissociated from it. Even the parts of you that are in your own personal mind behave independently of your wishes and your preferences and thoughts. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
So I've got 3 more questions from the chat then. Do you think you've got time for them or? Yeah. So why is it possible to determine when we're dreaming if both worlds are fundamentally the same nature?
Often you don't determine that you are dreaming while you are in the dream. Actually, you're not self-reflective at all during the dream. You're not even asking your questions like, how did I end up here? Why am I doing this? You know, this metacognitive mental processes, it has been shown scientifically already, a paper published in 2007 by Vint and I forgot. That you're not metacognitive during your dreams. You're experiencing things, but you're not pondering your experiences. You're not asking critical questions about it. You only become metacognitive upon awaking. And then through the mirror of memory, you can re-experience your dream metacognitively and know that you were just dreaming. In rare occasions, you can become a metacognitive during the dream. And then you know you're dreaming. It's called a lucid dream. It's a very tenuous state. It's very delicate. Either you collapse back into an ordinary dream and you no longer know you're dreaming, or you wake up fully and you lose the dream. But there is a boundary right in between, very difficult to stay there, in which you're still dreaming, but you know you're dreaming. If you put that back into our context of life, ordinary life is the dream. And again, why are you dreaming? You don't know that you're dreaming. That's why we think this is not a dream. We are in it. We don't know we are dreaming. When we die, we wake up. It's the end of the dissociation. And then we will probably know, oh, all right, that's what was going on all the time. Is it possible to have a lucid dream in life? Could life become a kind of lucid dream? I'm not an enlightened person, but I hear a lot about people who have woken up, who have realized, oh, this is really just a dream. Maybe that's what it is. It's the lucid dream equivalent of real life.
So someone has suggested that modern psychology doesn't recognize dissociative identity. And so saying that some of your views to do with that might be more pseudoscientific in their view. How would you respond to?
I can cite papers. I mean, this was a more or less valid statement to make until the 90s. Until the 90s, there was some polemic. Major psychology schools like Harvard, they didn't endorse this. They were doing very, very serious research on dissociative identity disorder. But there was a corner of the psychology society that would not grant validity to that. They would say the patients are dissimulating, they are pretending to have this condition in order to get attention, and what they want is to get attention. But with the advent of neuroimaging and the neuroimaging study of dissociation, that's basically out the window. This idea. In 2014, there was a major study done in the Netherlands. They put people suffering from dissociative identity disorder under functional brain scanners, and also actors pretending to themselves to have dissociative identity disorder. In other words, trying to think to themselves in the way a DID patient presumably would be thinking and feeling. And the brain scan images were fairly different. It was very easy to look at the images and say, these are the real patients, and these are the people pretending to themselves to have this condition. And then 2015, there was this amazing study in Germany. There was this woman with a variety of dissociated alters. And some of those alters were peculiar in the sense that they claimed to be blind. And the other alters were not blind, and the host personality was not blind. So the psychiatrists had this devious idea, let's hook up this woman to, I don't remember whether it was an MEG or an EEG. It was a brain imaging technique with very good temporal resolution, which you need in order to be definitive about the conclusions here. And when a sighted alter was in control, they could see normal brain activity here in the visual cortex at the back of the brain. And when a blind alter would be in control, even though the woman's eyes were wide open, brain activity in the visual cortex would disappear. Now, that's not something that's not something you can pretend. If you go to clinical psychology, dissociation has been taken seriously since the late part of the 19th century. I mean, just look at the history books in psychology. But if you think of psychology as, say, behaviorism, if you take one little niche of psychology and you say, this is the whole of psychology, yeah, then that statement would be true because of the redefinition of the word psychology. But in neuroscience, neuroimaging neuroscience, and psychiatry and clinical psychology today, no, dissociation is taken very seriously. It's a done deal, it's a proven fact, and there is no way to come back.
And then someone has asked a question which could be quite interesting about how your kind of computing background has informed your metaphysics, and whether you have any particular views then on things like AI as a result of kind of being well read in both domains.
Yeah, it's informed a lot. I mean, I was a sort of philosopher since I was a kid, but then I went to university very early. I had just turned 17. And then you sort of land in a completely materialistic world in which the materialists there are not materialists because they reason their way to materialism. No, it's just a habit. They just inherited it. Nobody's giving it a second thought. People are busy with science. Why would they think about metaphysics? And then I stopped philosophizing, and I did computer engineering and did a PhD in computer engineering, and I worked on AI for a few years. And then after that, I continued to work on AI as a private hobby. And years ago, I had this idea of, I knew I could make a computer relatively intelligent. In other words, have a computer process information in a way very analogous to how a human brain does it. I think AI will reach human intelligence levels. It's a matter of time. We will get there. And then I started thinking, if this thing is intelligent, is it also conscious in the way I am conscious? is its data processing accompanied by experience, the way the data processing in my brain is accompanied by experience. And I ask this question, because you have to differentiate between artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. Artificial intelligence is not a philosophical question. It's an engineering question. And I say that as a doctor in engineering. We will get there. Forget the philosophy. Yeah. It will happen. It's already happening. But artificial consciousness is not an implication of artificial intelligence. Yeah. What we mean by artificial consciousness is not only consciousness as an ontological category, but private conscious inner life, bounded by the boundaries of the system. In other words, if I make a computer intelligent, a computer conscious, then it's conscious in and of itself inside the computer. It's not a oceanic consciousness that pervades the computer. That I think is the case. I think universal consciousness pervades everything and it's the ground of everything. But when we talk about artificial consciousness, we mean something else with it, something more. We mean that not only does consciousness underlie it, but it has private conscious inner life, the way you and I have. And I crack my head on this, trying to figure out how do I process this data differently in order to give myself reason to believe that it would be conscious. And you pursue that path down all kinds of rabbit holes. You start thinking about how do we encode information. I shouldn't do arbitrary binary encoding because we don't do that as conscious beings. The percepts in our minds, they are semantically linked with entities with the world outside. You don't arbitrarily encode them through numbers. And then you start implementing harder ways to maintain the semantic link. It can be done. It's complicated, but it can be done. And I was deep into that. And at some point you realize, no, but this doesn't mean it would be conscious. It would only mean that there would be a semantic link with an object of the world outside. But that could happen without consciousness accompanying it, private consciousness accompanying it. And then eventually I read a very early paper by Dave Chalmers in which he laid out the problem I was facing. He basically said, there is nothing about physical arrangements in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience. And when I read that, it's like a nuclear explosion happened inside my mind. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm running against all the time. I change the physical arrangement and I look for a way to deduce experience from it, and I can't. And then I change the physical arrangement again, and I again look for a way to deduce experience from it, and I can't. I never have a reason to imagine that the experience accompanies it, private experience. Whatever way I change the arrangement. And once that bomb explodes in your head and you realize that you're hitting your head against a wall, and you have been for years, your knee-jerk reaction is to re-examine your hidden assumptions. And it happens very quickly. And then very quickly, in the course of a month or two, I re-examined my assumptions. And my assumptions were, well, the computer thing here in front of me, it's fundamentally outside and independent of consciousness. And I'm trying to make it generate consciousness. I'm assuming that there is a way to arrange this physical stuff outside consciousness to generate consciousness. That assumption is wrong. Okay. The computer is in consciousness. It is the image of a process in consciousness. For it to have private conscious inner life, it would have to be dissociated from the rest. What are the other instances of dissociated conscious entities that I know? They're living beings, because I am one. Do living beings look like a computer? No. No, a computer doesn't metabolize. A computer doesn't have mitosis, cell division, protein folding, transcription, ATP burning. It doesn't have any of that. Why would the computer be the image of a dissociated process in universal consciousness? I have no empirical reason to believe that.
Do you not suppose that private mental states are multiply realizable in that kind of way, that it could be the result of silicon, or it could be...
Could it be the case? Yes, it could be the case. Is that the interesting question? I don't think it is. I think the interesting question is, do we have any reason to think it is the case? And I think we don't.
And I suppose then, so do you think it's almost impossible? I think you've answered that it'd almost be impossible to demonstrate that there'd be something it's like to be a computer with consciousness that we'd made. But do you think it's possible for us to make something that would have this dissociated consciousness?
Yes.
You know, do you think so? You do think it? And have you got any further along thinking about how we might go about that? You know, assuming this kind of functionalist thing isn't quite enough to figure out, you know, to say, well, it does these inputs and outputs, but how do you think you would go about that?
Yeah, I didn't even need to go about it myself, because there's a bunch of very good people working on it, and they have been working on it for decades. Yes, I think we can, and eventually we will, artificially induce dissociation in universal consciousness. And what we will call it is the creation of life from non-life, abiogenesis. How do you create something that is living, something that metabolizes out of inert, non-living material? We've never managed to do that. We've managed to replace the DNA of a bacteria with synthesized DNA, but that the bacteria was alive and remained alive throughout the process. So I think we will create artificial dissociated consciousness, but that's just abiogenesis, the creation of life from non-life. Do I think we will succeed? Yes, we will succeed. When we succeed, what it will look like? It will look like a bacteria. Know what I mean? That's what it would look like. It would not look like a silicon computer. And by the way, there's a very good group at the University of California at Santa Cruz, including a friend of mine, who have made strides in understanding how life possibly could have begun, tackling the most vexing questions around that problem. And when I follow their work, and over the past 5-10 years, I have sort of, how to say, rekindled my hope that we will get there. We will manage to create life from non-life. I think that would be a spectacular day in the history of this planet. And I think there is even a chance it may happen in my lifetime. Yeah, knock on wood that it happens. Maybe it's too ambitious. But that would be the creation of artificial consciousness, not strong AI.
So you've just released your book, The Metaphysics of Schopenhauer Decoded, and you've got a series of other books as well to do with the metaphysics of idealism and so forth. How else can people kind of find out more about your work or anything like that if they want to read more around the subject or listen to more of you talking about these things?
If they type my name on Google, Bernardo Kastrup, especially between quotes, so you don't get the airport of Copenhagen because it's also Kastrup, put it between quotes and you will get a lot of things, including my website, which is bernardokastrup.com. And if you go there, there are links to everything else, to all my videos, essays, academic papers, theses, books, videos, podcasts, the whole thing is linked from there.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll end the stream there. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thanks everybody.
Yeah, and I'll put those links in the description as well if people want to check them out.